my talk for the morning. And we're talking about forgiveness, and so this is a perfect example of having to forgive things that are beyond our control, and just be in the space and know that there's the power and presence of spirit that's here with each one of us and with Jim. And it's a process that we go through many times. This month we're talking about the uh, inner life, and how living everyday splendor and wonder, and how that is affected by what our inner life is, and what's going on in our inner life is manifesting in the outer life. When we see that God is within us, we realize that we are part of something greater than ourselves, which is where we started the first week, seeing God within ourselves. And then last week, Reverend Barb talked about taking a pause to listen to that voice of spirit within our heart of hearts, and to fill our hearts with love and wonder. And when our conscious thoughts look to the external world around us as reality, we keep repeating those same old patterns again and again. We've got the same thoughts, the same feelings, the same experiences. But when we pause and we experience instead our connection with the one, with God, with all that is, with God, the infinite invisible, then life and unconditional love, it is peace and bliss. And that's what starts manifesting in our life, right? Oneness with God means that our essence as a part of the one is also life and love, peace and bliss. God is life and love. We are life and love. This is the divine intention for all of life, and including us. And how amazing this is. Now, in our first slide this week, I want to talk about why our life experiences are not all life and bliss. I mean, if this is our essence, why aren't we experiencing that all the time, right? Michael, can you share that first slide? Go back one, please. Not that one, Michael, the one before it. Okay. Well, it was the title slide. So, in this week, forgiveness is a spiritual practice that can restore our connection with spirit and the divine flow. And so the title for today is Forgive to Live. There we go. Thank you, Michael. And I'll tell you when I need the next slide. So anyway, it's the nature of God, the infinite invisible, to give itself, to give life in all of its fullness to everyone and everyone alike, right? To all of the universe. It gives everything and it withholds nothing, right? So if this is true, why then do we sometimes feel shut off from that good? Brenda was talking about the feeling of separation. Why does this come up for us? Why do we then sometimes feel resentful that when we think someone or some circumstance is blocking our flow of this good, right? How do we restore that flow of our good, our connection to God and the source that all that is? If oneness with God means that we are not separate from God, why do we feel so separate and alone sometimes, and even abandoned, right? Well, consider a pond. There's flow of water into a pond and out of a pond. And when that flow is blocked on either end, the pond will soon become stagnant, right? As bacteria and contaminants increase in that pond, if you're not washing it out, eventually that pond is going to become so toxic that you wouldn't want to drink it. Any fish that are living in the pond could die, right? Without the new supply, that pond could just dry up and vanish, be gone. But if the gates are opened and the flow is restored, then you have that movement of free flowing water. It's going to purify the pond. It's going to bring in fresh water. It'll mix in oxygen and carry out any contaminants. So a healthy environment can be reestablished. When we live our lives entirely within the physical world, the material world of effects, then we can feel that all we have to rely on is our own wits, our own resources that are limited by what we can buy ourselves, we can build with ourselves, figure out by ourselves. We're separate and alone. And we might have some people to assist us, but we don't have that greater power. So in science of mind, and this is what the next slide is about, this is what we call the science of mind symbol. And in the symbol, it shows it's got three areas with the V going down from the top. So the top is spirit, conscious mind. Well, first, the circle is everything is one. There is no separation. It is all one. So even though we're dividing it into these pieces, it is a perception. It's like, the Trinity of God. It's all three at the same time. But at the top, it's spirit, the conscious mind. This is where we set our intentions. And this is the divine intention is here at the divine level. But we also set our own intention at our personal level. The middle band is the subjective mind. And this is the unformed medium that all of the universe is formed out of, but it's the formless at this time. And then when that intention passes through that middle level, it is manifest in the outer world as the body, as the physical world. So when we're operating on our own, we're operating only at that lower level. And what's coming out of the new stuff that's coming into the world is based on what the race consciousness, what we call it is the same old ideas that we're recycling over and over. We get the same results. And these old ideas are the ones that have occurred over the millennia that humans have been alive, and we call this race consciousness. So some of these ideas and beliefs are true, and some are not. And some are just beginnings of something greater that's possible. So, but change occurs, but it occurs at the very, very slow rate of evolution. Right? Now, here's the exciting part. When we take the time to pause and meditate and elevate our consciousness to that level of the divine, right? So we're thinking not just with our own mind, separate, but we're thinking in the oneness, one with all that is, right? And we, at that level of consciousness, the Christ consciousness, some call it, when we set the divine intention to express the infinite invisible and all the qualities of God. So it's love, peace, happiness in the world. That is the new intention, that greater intention, being part of something greater that starts being manifest. And so the subjective mind has this new input, this infinite, wonderful input, and it starts to form these divine intentions into matter. So we call this involution. The world of effects can change very rapidly, not at the slow pace, but it's when the divine changes everything. So spiritual truth then can replace that race consciousness as the blueprint for the material world. And this is why we say, change your thinking, change your life. Now, I've covered this pretty quickly now, but in the class that's starting on March 2nd, it's called Change Your Thinking, Change Your Life. And so we'll be going into this in a lot more details so we can understand this process and how we can use it to change our lives. So it's a really amazing process, the creative process that we talk about in New Thought and in the Centers for Spiritual Living. Now, even though this the way this process is, and let's say that we're even trying to access this higher level of consciousness, but sometimes it still doesn't manifest. We're still stuck with our own intentions or on that our personal level and the race consciousness coming through. And why is that? There's some barrier that's blocking that divine flow, right? So let's go back to that stagnant pond. It seems straightforward. Okay, we'll sit down, we'll connect with spirit, and we'll set those fresh new intentions to flow, to create that fresh flow into the pond. But why doesn't it work? Well, the answer is that we're holding on to false beliefs and resentments, anger, condemnation of others or ourselves. Whether those transgressions were yesterday or many, many years ago. I mean, these false beliefs and think feelings can block that infinite divine flow from entering our lives. This is what's creating what's coming into our manifest lives. And so we continue to have that separation. We continue to have that limitation, right? Now, when we have these thoughts or beliefs about ourselves or anyone else, when we remember then that we are part of that one life that is God, we want to shift our experience. But the creative process doesn't care whether it is getting input from the divine, infinite, invisible, or whether it is getting it from the race consciousness or from our little personal separate intentions. Whatever it gets is what it puts out. So if what we're getting out is what we don't desire, then we need to change our thinking and try something else. We also need to remember that we are the ones that have created those barriers. It's not God. If we feel separate from God, it's not God that moved, it's us, because we are always a part of God. And so we've created this a barrier between us and God. So when we do have this flow and we don't have that fresh flow in from the infinite, then we've just got what we've got, and it can get used up and it gets stagnant and toxic. And particularly when we start blaming other people for what's going on in our lives. Our physical bodies can also manifest that stagnant flow. Brenda in the reading this morning was talking about how our physical bodies really outpicture for us what's going on. If we want a clue that our thinking is askew, then we can just see what's happening in our lives and in our physical bodies, right? So without getting connected to the infinite source, we can perhaps be really irritated by the people that are around us, or some action. Any of these things seem to ask us to share our remaining dwindling and increasingly toxic flow. We have less and you still want it more, So our emotions, our mental health, and our relationships can easily just deteriorate when we have this feeling of lack and limitation. So this is why forgiveness is such an important spiritual practice, right? It can restore the flow of good in our lives. And it starts with oneness, remembering that God is the source of all. The divine gifts of peace, happiness, and love have already been given. So when we forgive, we open up the gates for the circulation to come in. Forgiveness of ourselves and others removes those barriers that have created the separation between us and God and the source of life itself. And once those barriers are dissolved, then we are open to receive and share the infinite divine flow with others, as well as ourselves. We're open to experience wholeness and being loved, and being really loved, our entire being, because we are a part of God that God has created. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus said, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," in Matthew 6:12. Now, this is not a prayer of bargaining with God. Instead, it is a recognition that as long as we condemn others, we are maintaining a barrier between us and God, a barrier of our own making that will condemn us to those stagnant lives, to live with our debts. If we want them to be forgiven, we need to also forgive. What comes around goes around, right? We reap what we sow. And so when we forgive someone else, we are also forgiving ourselves. Remember that we're all one. And so any other person the other is not really an other, and the other people are really just another part of ourselves. So when we forgive someone else, we're also forgiving ourselves, right? Now, on the next slide, Jesus believed in radical forgiveness to the point of loving your enemies. He said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your enemies. Bless him who curses you. Do good to him who hates you. Pray for those who take you by force and persecute you. In so doing, you will be the sons of your heavenly Father,'" from Matthew 5. So forgiveness is as much or more for us as it is for the other person. You know, um, we think that it's kind of hard to do that sometimes, but after we have a few experiences where we learn to forgive, and it turns out that whatever happened, maybe it wasn't such a bad thing. So I have a story. It was one of my favorite memories I have of being with my dad. And it was the summer right after high school before I went to college, and I needed to get a summer job to save up some money for college. And so I didn't have a lot of work experience other than being a babysitter at that time. But I was pretty good at sewing. So I finally, in the newspaper, I found this job with a lady that sewed curtains and other kinds of things in her house. And I'd sewed curtains before. So I went over and I interviewed with her, and her house was hot and muggy, and she wasn't very pleasant to be around. But I really needed the money. So it paid better than working at McDonald's. So I said, okay, I'll take it. So about 3 days later, Saturday morning, I was supposed to show up for the first time at 9 o'clock. So I got, all dressed and I was ready to go. And my dad drove me over there, and I walk up to the door and nervously knock on the door. And she takes a long time to come to the door. It's like, isn't she expecting me? Then she opens the door, and well, she didn't really open the door. She just opened the big door and talked to me through the screen. And she said, why are you here? Well, you asked me to come to work today. I said, well, I already have somebody working. I don't need you. Goodbye. Okay. This was not a great experience at all. I was livid. And so my dad he understood what was going on. And so he said, Pam, let's go wash the car. So we went to one of those do-it-yourself car washes, and we washed the car and we dried it off. And then we took it home and we got out the polish, and that car had a great shine to it when we got through working on that car. And I really worked out a lot of that anger, but I still needed a job. So on Monday, I went to the student employment office that our city had. And I walked in, and it was on the second floor of a building. And so I walked in, and I went up to the desk, and the lady said, well, we don't have any jobs right now, but you can just fill out this form. So I was, again, disappointed. So I started filling out the form. Well, while I'm standing there filling out the form, a TV crew comes in, and they wanted to do a spotlight on this student employment office, because it was such a great thing for our community to employ the summer students. So they asked me, I was the only student there at the time. So they said, we'd like to film you walking in and out of the door and filling out the forms. And, so it'll be much better for the TV, Live at 5 TV that will have this on. So this is okay, fine. So I waited around, and so they filmed me walking in and out. It was kind of fun being on the TV and all that kind of stuff. Well, while I'm doing all of this, a boy walks in, student, and says, I'd like to apply for a job. So the same lady says, okay, we have 2 jobs. One is a farm worker and one is as a drafter. And I heard this, my ears perked up, because I had been the top person in my drafting class in high school, and I wanted to be a civil engineer or an architect. And so I walked over to the lady and I said, I want to apply for that drafting job. And she said, she kind of looked at me kind of funny. And I said, I told her about, my good grade in drafting. And so she said, okay. So she sent me over to the drafting job. So I got to be on TV, and I got a job in drafting, which paid much better than me being a seamstress. And it was air conditioned. I had great bosses, and I figured out I wanted to be a civil engineer instead of an architect. So it all worked out for the good. And so I learned that the lady, I was really grateful and thankful, and I forgave her. So she had a better employee for her, and I had a much better job. So, all of these things, when they don't work out, they are, they're really for our good. Spirit has something better in mind. When we do our prayer treatment, when we set our intention, it's really important that we say, this or something better, right? If we, if we just say we want exactly this, we'll get exactly that perhaps, but it may be limited and may not be the best thing for us. So if we let that divine intention know something that we don't know yet, that's always a good way to end our prayer. Now, another reason that sometimes people find it difficult to forgive, especially our enemies, is that they want to punish people for their sins or take revenge, right? You've done wrong. You need to be punished, and severely. Now, Ernest Holmes is clear on this point when he says in the Science and Mind glossary, he gives this definition of punishment. There is no sin but a mistake, and no punishment but an inevitable consequence. Wrongdoing has its punishment, for the law of cause and effect operates eternally. Right action also has its reward in the same way. He continues, people do make mistakes and they are therefore automatically punished, right? You have the consequences of your action. A lot of times with their kids, we need to give them the natural consequences of our actions so they can learn from their mistakes. You only touch the fire once. And that's probably the last time you're going to do that on purpose in your life, right? And the other thing, though, about it, as Ernest Holmes pointed out, is that people will continue to be punished until they find the way. It's kind of a rambling, seek and you shall find. It's like a what do you call it? Hunt and peck, trial and error. So if you keep having these consequences that you don't like, you're going to try something different, and eventually you'll come to something new. Now, there's also a way to another thing that happens, and this is from Dhammapada, which is a teaching from Buddha. And he says, he has insulted me. He has abused me. He has robbed me. He who lives with these thoughts will never be freed from hatred. For hatred never conquers hatred. Hatred is conquered only by love. This is the law, right? So when we have that hatred, when we live in that small world, the physical world only, and all of those feelings, it's only when we go to that higher level, to that divine level, and find that infinite love, unconditional love, that allows us to get beyond hatred. This is really important in our world today, where we're talking about, perhaps being on the brink of war, right? Krishnamurti, in our next slide, gave a speech at the UN in 1984. And he said, how can there be external peace in the world if one is not at peace with oneself? We will never answer that question. We are always trying to bring about change externally. We never seem to realize that unless each one of us changes radically, there will be no peace on earth, right? It's not about just changing, playing the game of Risk and moving things around on the board. It's about each one of us has to find that peace internally and allowing that to manifest rather than the race consciousness. The race war is not peace is not the absence of war. War is the absence of peace. And so when we have that divine intention coming through, that is what will be replaced. And that is what we're desiring. From a Buddhist perspective, a lot of life is about avoiding suffering. And there's a saying that's attributed to being a Buddhist proverb, but it most likely came from somewhere else. We're not quite sure where. There's so many places that it's listed. But in the next slide, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional, right? Now, this saying was popularized by a Japanese poet, Haruki Murakami, who's also a marathoner, right? And he says that pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Say you're running and you think, man, this hurts. I can't take it anymore. The hurt part is an unavoidable reality, but whether or not you can stand anymore is up to the runner himself or herself. So it is our attitude about that pain. It's that makes the difference. It's my attitude about having that lady shut the door on me when I thought I was going to go to work and finding something else, right? And so it took a little bit to work through that and to release it, but we want to do that. Now, there's lots of different ways that pain can turn into suffering. It depends on our response, and some of them we are able to release it easily, but then there's a lot of hooks that catch us and get us stuck on that pain. And a lot of it is, we're not living in the present. If we're always living in the present, that's the easiest way to let go of suffering and just be in the present moment. We also can try to ignore the pain. That's a favorite of some people. But if we just ignore the pain, we don't learn anything. We just keep on doing the same thing over and over again, right? The pain is there to teach us that we need something that needs to change. Some people like to make pain their story, right? We identify with the pain, call ourselves a victim, stuck with the pain. This is our lot in life, and we will tell anybody our story over and over and over again because this is who we are. We become depressed. We decide that we don't deserve anything better. We have an inferiority complex, or maybe we just decide that we're trapped in a vicious circle from which we cannot escape, right? This is getting stuck in the past. And so we live in the past, with that hurt that happened, yesterday or decades ago. And we block ourselves from living in the now, in the flow of wholeness and love, right? I mean, someone can get divorced 10 years ago and they're still angry about it, right? And unless they heal that, then if they are lucky enough to get married again, they may end up just marrying that same person with a new face, right? They'll attract that same type of relationship until they heal their own inner life, their own inner consciousness, and connect with spirit. That's when they're going to be able to, when they're healed and whole themselves, then they will attract a partner that's healed and whole. And so this falls into the trap, perhaps, of rejecting the pain or blaming someone else for the pain. It's not my fault. It's that person or this circumstance. I don't have any control. I'm just the victim here. Well, we have a choice. We have a choice to move out of that victimhood. And it is also important that when we have feelings, we don't just reject them and ignore them. When we're going through grief because we lost a loved one, or we've lost a job, or something is going on right now, COVID, we're grieving not being able to be together, right? And there's anger and disappointment. And so we need to face these feelings and observe, give ourselves time to process it. I went and washed the car, and also give them time to surface. We are human beings having we're spiritual beings having a human experience, but that human experience requires going through this process. We're learning about what it means to have those feelings rather than being all in the oneness, but seeing things move at a slower pace. And if we just stuff those feelings, then they're just going to sit there and they will, become stagnant within us and eat away at our minds and our hearts and our feelings and our lives. So we need to let them out and let them be neutralized by spirit, right? We are the ones that create the barrier, the feeling of separation. We are the ones that block that flow of good. And so through forgiveness, through forgiving ourselves many times for having been in that relationship or having been a victim, that is what we need to go through. and forgive ourselves. And so these experiences remind us that also that we can not receive what we don't accept, right? If we, if we say that I'm only going to have this little tiny cup to receive all the good, well, we're going to get a little tiny cup of good. But if we get a big barrel, and open up, we're going to have that greater good, because that's the infinite supply. And it's the supply that's, everything that we see in front of us is just infinite love that's available. Right? And so another skill that we learn is to look for that spiritual truth underneath whatever it is that's going on in front of us. Right? As a practitioner, one of the things we're trained to do is to, when we see something going on that we don't like, or something going on for a client, we stop, we get centered, we remember that God is all there is, we connect with that as ourselves and the client or the situation, and we see through that barrier, through that false experience, to that spiritual truth that is never changes, the changeless, the perfection, divine perfection that is always possible. Brenda talked in the reading today about Jesus, and when he was healing people, their physical health, quite often he forgave them, because he knew that it is that mental, emotional state of mind that is what was preventing them from experiencing their own wholeness, which is their natural state. And so he forgave them and freed them from that feeling of guilt, so that they could experience and receive that wholeness. There's a great story that Ram Dass tells, and it's in his book, How Can I Help? And it's a wonderful story. So it's about a burly, rough samurai, and big guy, and he comes over. He's used to fighting, and he comes over to this monk who's kind of a small guy, quiet guy, and he says, "Monk," in the tone of voice of someone who's obviously quite accustomed to having his words instantly obeyed. He said, "Monk, teach me something about heaven and hell." And the monk kind of looks up at this mighty warrior and replies with the utmost disdain, "Teach you about heaven and hell? I couldn't teach you anything. You're dirty. You smell bad. Your sword is rusty. You are a disgrace to the lineage of the samurai. Get out of here. I can't stand you." Well, the samurai, the big guy, he gets enraged and he trembles and his face is getting red, and this guy is resisting him and his authority. He's mute with anger, and he throws out his sword and he's ready to kill the guy, the little monk. And the monk looks up at him and says, "That is hell." So the samurai, he's shuddering at the thought, he's got his sword up here, and he's shuddering at the thought of the compassion and submission of this little monk who had risked his life to show him hell. As a monk, he's supposed to be about compassion. So slowly he lowered his sword, full of gratitude and suddenly at peace. And the monk told him softly, "And that is heaven." You see, the wound in me invokes the healer in you, and the wound in you invokes the healer in me. We are in this together. Right? Forgiveness is a spiritual practice. And so we attract these experiences into our lives, these people that irritate us the most, to learn some of the most important lessons of our lives. God did not create us to suffer. Forgiveness can restore that flow of good in our lives. In reality, forgiveness is an act of love. We have to open ourselves to that divine inflow of love in order to forgive. It's that divine intention, since we are divine creations, that we should love and be loved in return. Unconditional love. It's an amazing feeling. So forgiveness frees us to be that bridge for spirit to flow into form is that divine intention of love manifesting in the world. Forgiveness is an amazing spiritual practice and one that we can benefit from forgiving ourselves and forgiving others. Let's take this to prayer. So as we are still, we know that God is all there is. God is love. God is that divine intention of love for the whole universe. Love is the spiritual truth of me, of each person here, of all people, and of every experience in life, in my life. And so I turn to that power and presence of love within me. I know that spirit withholds nothing. I am surrounded by divine love. I release any barriers that I have allowed to form in me that have been blocking that flow of love in my life. Where there seems to be resistance, where there seems to be a lack, where there seems to be something blocking the flow, I let go. I release judgment or condemnation of any situation. I release the frustration of being stuck. I release any fear that I am not enough, that there is not enough God to go around, because it's obviously false. And so as I let go, that love comes through the cracks and dissolves that barrier until there is only that unobstructed flow of love and of peace. I sense that my very existence is God, is love, expressing itself in the world. I give and receive only love. I give and receive only peace. I know that this is the truth in my life, and I allow it to ripple out into the world. I know that this is the love and peace and abundance, the wholeness is the natural state of our center, and all of the lives that are touched by our center in these teachings. And I let it ripple out into our community, loving it, empowering it, nourishing it, and into all of the countries of the world where there is a feeling that war could be imminent. There is this love that is that spiritual truth underneath that is now coming up and manifesting. It might seem like weeds that are coming up through the ground, but it is determined to come through because it is the truth. And so by us knowing that it is there, it is nurtured and it is allowed to manifest fully in our minds. And as within, so without. And so is our consciousness, we know as a center of the universe that this is the truth. We know that there is no power other than love. Just as darkness is the absence of light, peace fills any void where there is an absence of peace and vanquishes it. Where there is a feeling of separation, of otherness, that wholeness of connection is the truth that is now vanquishing that darkness, that feeling of fear that is calling for love. And we know that there is infinite love to fill this need, this call, and it flows and soothes through all of the thoughts and fears. It flows through the hearts and minds. And there is a sense of coming to a new wholeness, of a shift, of a new path being possible. Something that is hoped for, coming out in a different way that is even higher and better than these ways of strife. And we forgive each other. We forgive ourselves for thinking that our way had to be the way. We forgive ourselves for thinking that God would not be enough. We forgive ourselves for thinking that there was not enough love and peace and joy to share with all people as one. And so, knowing this truth, I forgive and forgive again and again, 70 times 7, as it says in the Bible, again and again. And that spiritual truth is now rising and manifesting strong and whole and filling my whole being, the whole being of everyone here, of everyone in our center, of everyone throughout the world. This is the truth of who we are as one, loving and loved, and it is all good. I am so grateful to know this truth, to know that it is the eternal truth, that love is all there is. And so I release these words into the law, knowing that it is already manifest right here and right now. And together we say, and so it is.